The European Parliament just had elections, and there was a far-right surge across the board. Now, across the board, this is true, but it's not the only result from the European election. We need to talk about the broader results. But before we start on that, let me tell you what the European Parliament is. The European Parliament is the legislative arm of the European Union. That's its job. Pretty simple. Might as well keep it at that. And it being the legislative arm of the European Union, it influences European policy, regulations, import policy, all sorts of things. But it also means a lot of yelling and performative activism on the floor of the EU for more of the contrarian people, like say a Clara Day, or those people who go up there and are very anti the existence of the institute itself, because there are people in the European Parliament who were elected purely to go up there and say, wow, I do not like this institution. It is garbage. And then you've got people on the other end of the spectrum. So in Europe, once the dust had cleared, what had been cleared to everyone, once the dust had cleared, was that the far right had made gains, significant gains enough that it caused panic in a few countries, namely Germany, Italy, and France. Now, the ones that had the biggest gains, the ones where either the dominant or one of the predominant parties had made the largest gains, would be Germany and France. So these are going to be two that we concentrate the most on. But just know that it wasn't just in these countries that there were gains. There was also gains for the far right in Belgium. There were also gains for the far right in Italy. There were gains for the far right in other places as well. But let me be clear that the far right were not the only people that gained in this election. In fact, the opposition in Hungary actually made significant gains. And the Fidesz party, which is Viktor Orban's ruling party for the strong man over in Hungary, he took the biggest losses of his political career on the European level since he's come into power. And this isn't just in Hungary. There were other examples. For example, the Law and Justice Party in Poland were unable to obtain a majority in the European Parliament, and Donald Tusk was able to just barely beat them back. Some people say this is a victory for progressives in Poland, but I mean, I think it's calling Donald Tusk a progressive is kind to Donald Tusk. He is definitely a liberal. He is definitely somebody pro-EU, and I certainly favor him over the Justice Party. And somebody who's, I think, even more supportive to Ukraine than the Law and Justice Party was. So that's certainly something that you could point to as is different of the far right arc and trend that people are talking about here. And there's other examples as well. For example, and this is less important for this that we're talking about, but I do want to mention it. Clara Day and Mike Wallace, two long-standing pro-Russia, pro-Assad voices from Ireland, got ejected. And when I say they got ejected, you might have seen them from like Twitter videos or YouTube videos getting pushed by either Russian propaganda accounts or people trying to make excuses for the Russian regime. Clara Day came in like 7th. So these people were not popular in their home constituencies. They were not popular in Ireland. So when you hear the Assadist dribble from them, hear the nonsensical anti-Ukrainian dribble from them, just know that it wasn't popular. They're no longer in the EU Parliament.
Mako has donated $10. Welcome back to YT.
I'm happy to be remonetized. Thank you for the $10. Can we actually look at the Clara Day results? Because as much as I don't want to concentrate on these two independent EU legislators, my gosh, the election results were brutal. And I also don't like them both very, very much. I have been honored to have been able to use this platform as a powerful voice for peace, anti-militarism, and neutrality, she said of her time in the European Parliament. This result is not a rejection of those ideas. I don't know what she thinks, okay? Now, she just threw these words out there. I disagree with her classification of her being champions of these things, because if you're simping for Assad, you're simping for the Russians, okay? That's not anti-militarism. You're enabling militarism. At a certain point, pacifism, blind pacifism in the face of aggression, just becomes pro-militarism of the aggressive state. of the aggressing state. If you look at the German invasion of Poland and you tell the Poland's to put down their arms and surrender, give up, stop fighting, like just give in, you know what, give them Danzig, give them this land, give them Silesia, give them what was once like, you are just pro the militarists that are aggressive. Your pacifism becomes pro the aggressing power. I mean, if we're gonna hear from leftists all the time, and I do, like, I'm sympathetic to the sentiment of like, if you're passive, if you're inactive, if you don't go out and fight against the system, you are accepting the system, and then you go out there and you're actively telling those resisting militarism and resisting aggression to put down their arms. I mean, come on. Either way, she came in like 7th. Do we have the result? I want to see the numbers. Not elected. She was. She got 7%. She got 7% of the vote. Oh my God, Putinism is not in fashion. And mind you, she defined herself off of her Putinism. She defined herself off of her isolationism. She defined herself off of her foreign policy contrarianism on the Ukraine issue, on a whole host of issues. So her taking this L is an L for Putinism, is an L for those things. In some instances, and this is something we're going to get into in a moment, the election results in the European Parliament is in relation to a whole bunch of issues. Now, Americans not knowing these issues and not being familiar with, like, for, say, the actual flowing of the migrant issue in Europe, or for example, farmers' issues, or for example, issues with cost of living, or for example, issues with housing, issues with job opportunity, issues with all sorts of different things that are motivating European voters to go out there. A lot of people will project the issues that are motivating voters. And so before we talk about the two things of consequence, which is going to be the AfD vote in Germany and going to be the rise of Marie Le Pen's National Front, France in the European Parliament, before we do that, I want to show one example which we can use as a launching off point of just the worst possible misinformed opinion on this war. On the European election results, sorry. Let's read David Sachs' conclusions from the European Parliament elections, and then we'll get into the meat and bones, what really came from this. Europeans are tired of war. They want their leaders to focus on defending their own borders rather than Ukraine's. Belgian Prime Minister has resigned. Sunak and Macron could be gone next month. And Zelensky is only around because he canceled the elections. Bad news, Biden. Okay, so from start to finish, from the first sentence to the last, every single part of this was a bunch of horse hockey. Every single inch of it, okay? So let's start the first thing. Europeans are tired of war. The war in Ukraine was not the number one motivator for voters to go out. Now, I'm sure that the war in Ukraine had some some impact for some people, and I'm sure it was an issue that did loom over the election to some degree, but there are a million different issues that are motivating voters, whether it has to do with migration inflows, whether it has to do with farmers' regulations, whether it has to do with the price of housing, whether it has to do with inflation, whether it has to do with energy costs, whether it has to do with all sorts of regulatory and economic and number of social political issues. And to just kind of boil it all down to Europeans are tired of war. I mean, imagine if Joe Biden won re-election and I came out and said, Joe Biden won re-election because Americans support Ukraine. Now, I'm sure that there are Americans who would have voted for Joe Biden because he supports Ukraine. Ukrainian Americans especially. I'm sure there's others who take national security issues like me very seriously, and not as a buzzword, but actually as a actual issue. But if I was to say that, it would be horribly ignorant, because I would be ignoring, say, the criminal convictions of Donald Trump. I'd be ignoring authoritarian tendencies that are going to motivate people to come out and vote against him. And while canvassing in Ohio, I met people who were motivated to go out to vote against Trump. Sorry, there is a gigantic Ukrainian mosquito still harassing me, to come out and vote against Trump because that was their primary motivator. There's going to be people who go out and vote based upon the price of housing, who's going to go out and vote based upon abortion, because that is a big issue. Roe versus Wade being overturned still is having ripple effects all throughout American society, especially in states where a woman's right to choose is being genuinely put into question. And so for me to boil it all down into my one pet issue would be insulting the people I am speaking to, and it would be insulting to the people who have a diverse experience set that leads to them going out and making their voting decision. Just to give you the perspective of what this looks like to a European, it'd be like me coming out and saying, "Oh, Joe Biden won re-election because Ukraine." Okay, continuing. They want their leaders to focus on defending their own borders rather than Ukraine's. Now, again, migration is a big issue, but what he is saying is suggesting that the majority of Europeans have turned against supporting Ukraine. The polling data does not reflect that. And we're going to get into specifics about why his examples that he's trying to use to support this point are bogus. Let's start with the first one. The Belgian prime minister has resigned. This is true. The far right in Belgium had very good parliamentary results, but they actually performed under what the polling data suggested they were going to perform and were unable to attain a majority, even predominance, with the center-right conservatives in Belgium still winning the elections and being very, very, very much pro-sending aid to Ukraine. So any government they put together is still going to be in favor of the F-16 program that the Dutch have agreed to, and that the now resigning prime minister has set the Netherlands on the path on. Mark Rutte, who is has been a big supporter of the Ukrainians. So using this as evidence for a drop in support of Ukraine aid is just nonsense. And it certainly was not the issue that was predominant over the Dutch election with Ukraine aid. Sunak and Macron could be gone next month. So the Macron point is just a lie. The next presidential election in France is in 2027. Macron has just dissolved parliament after the national rally in France performed very well. This is the first time we're actually going to really break down the specifics here. But if you look at, I think you can go down and do it by country. You could see here in France, you see that it says ID and it's at 31%. That's the National Front. They performed much better than Macron's party, which is the Liberals, which got about 15% of the vote, compared to the the left and the Social Democrats 14 and 15, left 15%, and the Social Democrats 14%, 3 and 7%. He decided after these parliamentary results, these EU election results, he was going to have parliamentary elections. So he dissolved parliament. I saw like the redhead libertarian, which is Tim, a co-host, say this was authoritarian, and this shows like the dictator tendencies of Macron, which is pretty silly because number one, the president of France has the right to dissolve parliament, call for elections, and now there's going to be elections in France on June 30th and July 7th in 2 rounds, and that's how democracy works. He saw there was a shaking of confidence in whether or not this government in France should be the one ruling. And then the opposition, Marine Le Pen and her party, the National Front, called for parliamentary elections. He says, okay, let's have parliamentary elections. And then uneducated Americans come in and call it authoritarian. He's giving the opposition exactly what they wanted, to their surprise, mind you, to their surprise. But the National Rally performed very well. But no matter what the results of the election, whether or not the National Rally performed well in Parliament, and then they get to appoint Marine Le Pen's protege as the prime minister, and then you're going to have a period of cohabitation in France, which means there's going to be the National Front and Macron's liberal government is going to work together in order to govern France, with the prime minister covering domestic affairs and the president covering foreign affairs, broadly speaking, not to get into the specifics. There's only been 3 periods in French history where this period of cohabitation has gone into existence, and some people speculate that part of the reason why Macron is calling for elections right now, there's a bunch of reasons why people are saying this. One of the speculations is because people are saying, oh my God, why would you call elections right now when you just perform so badly? That every single cohabitation prime minister has lost. And so if the National Rally wins and then they appoint their prime minister, Every single time that has been followed by the prime minister losing that position. And so it could be that Macron's like, okay, fine, win the parliamentary elections, I'll stay president, and then come 2027, instead of you guys becoming president, the whole country will see that the National Rally are a bunch of clowns, and then you're going to get swept. There's some other theories as well. There's a theory that this is going to cause like a rally around the flag effect, and that Macron, like he said, quote unquote, trusts the French voters, and they'll see the prospect of the far right being able to actually attain governmental power, and they'll say, okay, you know what, we're going to go with at least one of the more moderate parties. We're going to go vote Green. We're going to go vote Social Democrat. We're going to go vote whoever. Just don't want the far right to be in power. And considering it's going to be very hard for the far right to get over 50% in the first round of voting, which in French politics is 2 rounds of voting. The first round is going to be on June 30th, and if a party can get over 50%, then they win. But that's very unlikely, especially considering that Marine Le Pen's party is on the far fringes, and it's much harder for them to get over 50% the first round. But in the second round, they take out all the people who are under a certain threshold, and they just have the big parties compete. And if they can get over 50%, then it's that's how you decide like elections in the second round. I'm sorry, I'm simplifying it, but that's how the elections are going to go. The idea is going to be that this coalition is built against the fringe far right, and that the liberals and the social democrats and the center in French politics beat them back. He's trusting in the French people. Either way, though, no matter how the election results go in France and how Macron's gamble pays off, and he has been somebody who gambled in politics before, and this isn't the only theories. I'm just throwing out 2 of the theories that I've heard that I thought were at least semi-credible. If he loses, he will not lose his position as president. He will not lose his position as president. In fact, one of these theories is based on the fact that he will not lose his president. He wants to deny them from becoming president. But yeah, so David Sachs is just wrong here. He cannot lose his position as president. So Macron cannot be gone next month. The soonest Macron could be gone, unless he resigns, is 2027, because that's when the next presidential elections are. As for Sunak, it is true that Sunak is almost certainly gone. The Conservative Party's calling of snap elections has turned out to be a disaster. Sunak's call for national service has not rebounded their support. His debate with Keir Starmer did not lead to Sunak instilling confidence in the population. And the Conservatives are headed towards probably one of the worst results in the party's history. With the Reform Party, which is kind of a farther right conservative party being championed by people like Nigel Farage, who was a big champion of the Brexit movement, big champion against immigration in the United Kingdom, is taking away their votes, and there's a chance they might even outperform the Conservatives, crushing the party, which is leading some Conservatives to even like campaign on the idea of like, please don't vote Reform. If you vote Reform, then Labour will win, and then we'll have Keir Starmer government. But no matter how poor the Conservatives are going to perform, because Sunak will not be prime minister once this election is over. The trends show that clearly. Keir Starmer will be the prime minister to replace him, the Labour prime minister. Whether it's going to be a government that has over 50%, and then it'll just be a straight Labour government, whether it's going to be Labour and the Greens, whether it's going to be Labour, Greens, and the Lib Dems, I have no clue. Okay, Ed Davey seems to be leader of the Lib Dems, doing a pretty happy-go-lucky campaign, and they might actually be polling better than Conservatives, so it might be a Lib Dem Labour government. But Keir Starmer, who would be the other prime minister to replace Sunak, is very pro-Ukraine. The Labour Party is very pro-Ukraine. Ed Davey is very pro-Ukraine. He's the Lib Dem guy. This would be the party making a coalition with the Ukrainians. The Greens are pro-Ukraine too. Okay, they're not like American Greens and led by Jill Stein. Okay, who's going to lick their boots. They're actually pro-Ukraine too. So we got a bunch of people who would be pro-Ukraine. That doesn't mean everybody in Labour is like pro-Ukraine, but it would be a pro-Ukraine government. So Sunak being replaced, number one, I don't think David Sachs would like Labour, since they are generally more left-wing than Conservatives, even though Keir Starmer is certainly not the most left-wing Labour candidate that's ever existed, definitely following in the footsteps of Jeremy Corbyn. This is not an indication of a lack of support for Ukraine, because Sunak's going to be replaced by Keir Starmer, somebody who's very pro-Ukraine. And as for this last conclusion, which is Zelensky is only around because he canceled elections, I mean, Zelensky is polling above basically all political opposition outside of Zaluzhny. Zaluzhny has not indicated that he wants to participate in civilian politics yet, even though that is something that people highly suspect. And so if there was elections, there's a good chance Zelensky would win under the pretext of, hey, he's gotten a lot of support from the international community. Zelensky was the first one to tell the Ukrainian story on the international level before. Able to get everybody to pay attention to Ukraine struggle. Let's support him. Let's get behind him. But he's still overwhelmingly popular. And Winston Churchill was overwhelmingly popular during World War II, and he canceled elections. The Ukrainians are canceling elections because millions of people are displaced. They're overseas as refugees. Millions of people are still in occupation. There's a war going on, and people don't want polling stations bombed. They don't know how to really, they have never organized an election in these types of conditions before. So for safety reasons, for a whole bunch of reasons, they have decided not to have that election. Now, you can be against it, you can be for it. That perspective, I don't really think matters, and at least the reflection that this does not mean democracy in Ukraine is dead. It merely means that the next election has been postponed until the war is over. And Ukraine has been invaded before, like back in 2014, and they had elections. Had elections in 2019, and Petro Poroshenko was replaced by Zelensky, and there was a peaceful transfer of power. That was after a war had happened, when they could have used the fact that a war was technically going on, maybe to strong arm. Petro Poroshenko could try to strong arm it into longer terms of power, but he was smart enough to know that the Ukrainian people would not accept that after he was elected on a mandate after Euromaidan, a pro-democracy protest movement. And Zelensky is definitely still riding the Euromaidan mandate. Point is, I think from start to finish, I think David Sachs was wrong on every single front here. I've already talked about France. I already talked about a bunch of these. One thing he did not mention, though, was Germany. And so I do want to mention Germany, because if you look here, you can see that leading Germany is actually the Christian Democrats. That's Angela Merkel's party. They performed and they got 31% of the vote, which is very good for them. And then the next in line, which many people would have thought would have been Olaf Scholz's party, the Social Democrats, and that has been the historical German political divide, has been between Christian Democrats and the social Democrats. Instead, we have this big party out, the AfD, which was on the fringes of the far right, has now worked its way more and more into trying to consider itself the quote-unquote political mainstream, but has been having trouble, scandal after scandal, making it certainly not look like the political mainstream, to the point where no other party in German politics will agree to work with them. And not only no other party in German politics will agree to work with them, Le Pen's National Front, like as European identitarian as you can imagine, will not agree to work with them. That's how isolated the AfD has made itself through its actions. This through a whole bunch of reasons. One reason is that one of its leading candidates recently was coming out and saying, questioning the criminality of the SS. There was also the problem of multiple candidates being found and staffers being found spying for foreign governments, with one staffer being found spying for the Chinese, another staffer another candidate for office possibly being found spying for the Russians and working as a Russian intelligence asset, as that investigation is still ongoing. I mean, this is, and we're not just talking about like a minor candidate here or there. We're talking about big headliner candidates for the AfD being found for this. And this isn't particularly surprising, because AfD candidates and politicians had been going to Ukraine, working occupied territory as election observers, as fake election observers, and working as basically propagandists for the Russian government, pretending that their occupation was legitimate. So is it really that surprising that a party whose members go and do that and they don't get removed for it, they don't get lambasted or dragged through the mud by their own party for it, they instead allow that to happen, is going to end up having this problem? And so due to the intelligence problem, due to the fringe statements said by many of its leaders, due to it's just general party isolation in its own country. I mean, even the identitarian movements throughout other places in Europe are hesitant to work with the AfD. So when you look at these vote totals, right, for like who controls what in parliament, and you can see the center right controls all this blue, the center left controls all this red, and then you get to the national conservative groups, and then you get down all the way here to Marine Le Pen's group. Then you got Alternative for Deutschland right here, AfD. This is not a governing coalition. They're not even close to a governing coalition. I would say the big things you should be looking for actual impact on European politics is that expect there being more attempts to appeal to these voters to win back over, right? Whether it has to do with stronger stances on farming regulations, whether it has to do with stronger stances on trying to block migration. That's the type of stuff I would immediately imagine. I do not see this having any impact at all on the war in Ukraine whatsoever. And I mean that legitimately. Even in worst case scenario, and let's say Marine Le Pen's party wins this follow-up election in France and Macron's gamble does not pay off unless he's aiming for that 2027 presidential thing by sinking their party through humiliating them through 3 years of cohabitation. I don't know. It's kind of not a good tactic when you want to humiliate your enemy by giving them power. That's usually like worst case scenario. But no matter how this goes, I don't see a path for this ending support for Ukraine. I don't see a path for this ending the military aid, ending the financial aid, ending the recent $50 billion loan that was announced, ending the liberalization of the Western allowance of Ukraine to use its weapons to strike Russia. I don't see that changing at all. I mean, even like Marine Le Pen's prime minister candidate, he did say that he was against Macron's escalation against the Ukrainians, but the president in France is the one who has like large deference over foreign policy. So even worst case scenario, Macron would be the one still having the steering wheel on foreign policy issues if the National Front wins in France, and it will still be able to guide France if he's consistent with his current policy, which generally be supportive of Ukraine aid, generally be supportive of the Ukrainians resisting the Russian aggression. So I don't think David Sachs was even on the same planet of, God, man, these flies are really harassing me, was even on the same planet of what is real, what is likely, what is a real possibility of not only what motivated this election result, but what will be the result of this election result. I think the main thing is going to be more identitarian signaling in European politics, more commentary and advertisements for parties on issues of migration, and is going to be concentrating on trying to win back the disaffected voters that might have felt like, I'm going to vote this way to shock the government. People who voted for Trump in the way that I want to light a Molotov cocktail and throw it into the establishment, which was a real thing in 2016, but was something that went away, or at least was not as powerful in 2020 because the election. So I think you probably see an attempt by many parties to try to make inroads to them. Some will just ignore it. I know in German politics, there is a kind of social standard to ignore the quote unquote angry voter. See, a voter is like kind of like lashing out and my goodness, these migrants and da 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 da. If we don't lower ourselves to their level, if you'll tolerate, if you do that, you'll signify and signal to other voters that this is actually an important issue. But I think that is going to become more likely, whether or not that's a social standard, whether or not parties want to signal. There's a market for it, and people are going to go out, politicians and activists are going to go out and try to signal to the market, win over that market. So I think that's going to be the result of this election. Going to be a change in rhetoric from European political leaders that attempt to signal towards these issues that are important to either the center right or the fringe right. And by the way, let me mention the center right made gains too here. So the center right are going to be the ones at the helm here. So that's another reason why I think this rhetoric shift is going to be more likely, because I think the center right is much more likely to engage in that type of shift than, say, Olaf Scholz government, say any other social democrat to left government. Either way, I think David Sachs is off base. This isn't the end for Ukraine support, but this does show a far right lurching on the European continent, which is concerning and needs to be not ignored, but taken head on. Now, whether Macron's tactic of taking it head on is going to pay off is another question.